Hello and welcome to the Scottish Parliament virtual question time on the subject of education and skills. I'm joined today by 14 members of the Scottish Parliament from their homes and constituencies around the country, and by 4 government ministers from the education and skills team led by Cabinet Secretary John Swinney. Now we're going to go straight to questions, and I'm going to start with the first question from Claire Adamson. Claire Adamson. Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
I'm afraid, Presiding Officer, I was unable to hear Claire's question.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Swinney. In that case, could I ask Claire Adamson to repeat her question? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, in relation to the SQA guidance that's been issued, to provide reassurance that the ranking of candidates will not undermine teacher judgment? And can he outline how moderation processes can ensure parity across schools and subject areas?
Cabinet Secretary,
The important point to remember here, Presiding Officer, is that we're dealing with an unprecedented situation where we're having to ask teachers to refine the judgments that they are making about the potential attainment of young people. So the SQA have asked teachers to go into more detail about the expectations they would have for young people. That will be done across an expanded number of bands than would normally be the case. And teachers will be invited to set out within those bands the expected rankings of individual young people. Now that's essential to enable the SQA to be able to make a judgment about the awarding of qualifications around the country. And that will involve a process of moderation within individual schools, but there will then be a process of moderation which will involve the SQA, as there is in every exam diet, where there is moderation exercised across the whole of the country to make sure that an A grade in one school is essentially achieved with the same contribution as an A grade in another school around the country. And that's essential for the maintenance of standards across our national examination system.
Thank you very much. Jamie Green, to be followed by Ian Gray. Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister previously indicated that schools might remain closed until at least the summer break, but the prospect of them remaining closed until August is of concern to many. Given that a review of restrictions will take place every 3 weeks, the public will rightly expect clarity and detail over the government's plans for education. Many will also reasonably expect that if the country eases out of lockdown, then schools could or should do the same. So the question is, Cabinet Secretary, what tests or criteria will be used by the Scottish Government to decide if, when and how schools should open again? And given the negative impact on attainment that a lengthy closure could have, is it possible that schools might even, in part, reopen during the summer with all the benefits that would bring to parents and pupils?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first thing I would say is that I recognise the difficulty caused by the prolonged closure of schools, and I don't want schools to be closed for a minute longer than is required. First Minister, in her briefing today, and I answered a government-inspired question on this subject earlier on today, has published a document which essentially sets out the conditions and tests that the government would have to consider before we relax the restrictions that are in place across the board within our society today. And of course, one important element of those restrictions is the restrictions on the opening of schools. Now, the key test, and this is the point that Mr. Green asked me about, is that we must be satisfied that the reproduction number of the coronavirus is as close to zero as it possibly can be. Now, we know that if the reproduction number of coronavirus goes beyond 1, we are in a very acute situation where our National Health Service would face significant challenges, and there would be very significant loss of life as a consequence. So the work that members of the public are doing today to suppress the virus is really important in interrupting its flow. And any judgment that is made about the opening of schools has to be set within that context. It cannot be taken in some way apart from that overall decision-making that we take forward as a society. So what I would assure Mr Green is that there's active discussions underway with all stakeholders in education. Indeed, I'll be convening a discussion on this tomorrow to look at all of the practical issues that arise out of the whole question of reopening schools. But fundamentally, the judgment has got to be based on the public health advice that's available to us to determine what's the right and the safe course of action to take in the wider issues in terms of public health.
A very brief supplementary from Jamie Green.
Nelson, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that update. If the scientific evidence does demonstrate that it would be safe to open schools, how quickly could they open?
Cabinet Secretary.
A number of practical issues that would have to be borne in mind, but I think one of the important elements to remember here is that I don't envisage schools quite simply being able to go from being closed today to being open in a couple of days' time. We would have to, as a number of scientific commentators have made clear, we will be living with social distancing, for example, for quite some considerable period of time. So the principle of social distancing would have to be applied to our educational settings, which, as colleagues will be familiar, are not habitually observed within Scottish education. So I think there's a number of imponderables that have to be looked at as to how we could open schools and in what format we could open schools. But the assurance that I give to Mr Green is that I would want to make sure that we open schools as early as we possibly can do, that we do that consistent with scientific advice, and that we must always be taking action which is in the interests of preserving public health and public safety as we take those decisions.
Thank you. Ian Gray to be followed by Andy Whiteman. Ian Gray.
My question is for the Cabinet Secretary. With exams cancelled, parents and pupils do need absolute clarity about how they will be graded. And I listened very carefully to Mr Swinney's answer to Claire Adamson, but there has been confusion about this. And yesterday, the SQA said this: our moderation process will include analysis of centres' estimates and outcomes, prior attainment, progression statistics, and grade distributions by centres, of course. You mean schools or colleges, exam centres. So for the avoidance of doubt, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm that a pupil awarded a pass grade by their teacher's judgment could be subsequently failed by the SQA on the basis of their school's performance in previous year's exams?
Mr Swinney.
I think it's important that all of the factors that Ian Gray cited, which are the correct outline of the factors identified by the Scottish Qualifications Authority in the exercise of their moderation functions, are taken into account. As I said in my earlier answer to Claire Adamson, there will be moderation at different levels. There will be moderation within the classroom, there will be moderation within departments, there will be moderation within schools, and there will be moderation by the Scottish Qualifications Authority. And that's each step of that is important to make sure that we have confidence right across the country that there is a robust approach being taken in relation to the certification of qualifications this year. So all of those factors that Mr Gray cited will be relevant factors for the SQA to take into account. And the SQA will be there will be a situation that exists where the SQA may increase a grade that is awarded, or it may decrease a grade that is awarded. And that is an essential element of the moderation process that has to be undertaken, and indeed is taken forward on an annual basis.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman to be followed by Beatrice Wishart. Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary. In relationship to the current exam diet, will pupils be informed of the grade their teacher proposed awarding them, in addition to the grade the SQA eventually issues? And will they be able to appeal their grade directly, even if their teacher and the SQA are in agreement?
Cabinet Secretary.
The issue of what information about teacher judgment is given to an individual pupil is a matter for the individual school and the local authority, because they are the people who retain the data, and the government does not hold that data, so we don't have that locus to exercise a responsibility there. It's a matter for the school and the local authority. In relation to the question of the appeal that Mr. Whiteman has raised, any pupil will be able to appeal the ultimate qualification that they are certificated with by the SQA, and that process, I'm very pleased to say, will be a free appeals process available to any pupil as part of this year's exam diet.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart, to be followed by Rona Mackay. Beatrice Wishart.
It's a question for the Cabinet Secretary, and it's following on the questions about the SQA. In terms of the awarding and the moderation, how will the system deal with situations where pupils and teachers have changed schools recently, in terms of teachers not knowing their pupils?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney. I think I'd probably be best, Presiding Officer, to ask the Chief Examiner to respond directly to the point that Beatrice Wishart has raised. I recognise it's an important issue. My sense would be that there would have to be dialogue between the relevant teachers from the current and the previous school to enable that the grade to be submitted by the current school where the young person is registered as a pupil. But I think it's of a level of operational detail that I think I better ask the Chief Examiner to write to Beatrice Wishart on that question, and I'll arrange for that to be the case after this question time.
Thank you very much. I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Education. To ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government is continuing to monitor the attainment gap and what work has been done to ensure that all pupils, no matter their background, have the same opportunity to gain a place at university in this year's admissions.
Cabinet Secretary.
The closure of the poverty-related attainment gap is the central theme of government education policy. So quite clearly, the period of educational disruption that we are going through is a matter of great concern, and I want to ensure that there is every effort put in place to close the poverty-related attainment gap and to make sure that every young person who is dealing with the impact of poverty on their life is able to achieve the support to which they are entitled. Now, of course, we have in place the support through pupil equity funding and the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which directs over £180 million worth of resources directly to schools and to relevant local authorities. And what we've said to schools and local authorities is that they've got freedom and flexibility to judge how best to use those resources to maximum effect. And I want to make sure that in the period of remote learning that we're currently going through, that young people are supported directly by their schools to meet their needs. And I know that in different parts of the country, different schools and different local authorities are providing that support in a variety of different ways. There will be practical issues around that. Some young people in poverty may not have access to digital connectivity, and I know that schools are working in a very focused way to try to overcome that through either the distribution of devices or by enabling access to data to enable young people to be able to make to continue their learning. So there's a lot of practical work underway to try to support young people in that context. And of course, when we are operating our education system in the more habitual fashion to which we've been accustomed, we will obviously want to reinforce our efforts to close the poverty-related attainment gap as part of that work. And lastly, briefly, Presiding Officer, on the question of university access. Obviously, university access will hinge on the results that young people achieve, but our universities remain absolutely committed to the widening access agenda in which they have made significant progress and which the government is committed to maintaining in the period going forward.
Thank you. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to be followed by Daniel Johnson. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you. This is a question for the Minister for Further and Higher Education. Scotland's universities face significant financial difficulties in the weeks and months ahead, with a loss of revenue from commercial activities and real uncertainty of the number of overseas students taking up places next year. Financial black hole of £500 million is a real possibility. So can I ask the Minister what discussions he's held with Scotland's higher education sector, and what assurances he has been able to give them that the Scottish Government will provide the required financial support the sector will so desperately need going forward?
Minister Richard Lockhead.
I thank Jamie Halcrow-Johnson for the question. Of course, he's quite right. There's a potential huge impact on further and higher education in Scotland as a result of COVID-19. I've established a high-level response group comprising the university and college principals and the sector representatives, all our government agencies and the unions and so on, so we can steer the sectors through this crisis. We have already announced a £5.5 million package for support to address student hardship, to help students who face a tough time at the moment as well, clearly. And of course, we're also in regular contact with our UK counterparts in terms of what other support may be available at UK level to help the UK's universities, including Scotland's universities, at this time. And we're currently in very regular dialogue with the Scottish Funding Council, who next week will be providing updated figures on the financial impact of the current situation on further higher education. So we're determined to support our universities and indeed our colleges at this time to get through this, because of the huge challenges they currently face. And you quite rightly highlight the biggest challenge for our universities in particular is the huge drop expected in international students coming to Scotland, given that that represents a large slice of income for the university sector in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can I call Daniel Johnson to be followed by Gillian Martin? Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question follows directly on from Jamie Halcrow-Johnson's question. So some institutions' reserves are significantly less than their annual fee income. So does the Minister for Higher Education agree with me that there's a very real risk that some institutions may actually fail financially without intervention from the government? And is the Scottish Government ready to step in and make sure that that does not happen?
Minister Richard Lockhead.
Can I tell Daniel Johnson I've had individual conversations with every university principal in Scotland over the last week, over and above our ongoing interaction with University Scotland and other stakeholders on this issue. They are doing a grand job just now trying to get to grips with what is a very serious situation. They are putting in place contingency plans and they're prepared to take all kinds of measures to make sure they can get through this. But of course, you are quite right. The Scottish Government is ready to stand by our universities. We're exploring every avenue we have available to us to support our universities get through this and to avoid the potential scenario that you outline. There's no reason for thinking that is the case at the moment. What I'm hearing back from universities is they're being incredibly responsible. They're meeting this challenge as best as they can, but of course we still don't know the scale of it, and that will become clearer over the coming weeks and months. And that is why, as a Scottish Government, we've said we're going to do everything we can to support the sector, but also we are having those regular discussions, including today that I've been speaking to my UK counterparts, about what more can be done at UK level to help us make sure our universities can survive this crisis and contribute towards Scotland's recovery at the same time.
Thank you. Gillian Martin to be followed by Jeremy Balfour. Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Minister for Further and Higher Education as well. The SQA released information about when pupils will be getting their results, their higher results, on the 4th of August, and that's most welcome knowing that. I have a question though about what the Scottish Government's doing with regard to working with universities to ensure that we're getting offers. We've got a lot of pupils who have conditional offers at the moment, and they're wondering whether or not that's going to follow the same kind of pattern, if it's just going to there's not going to be a delay in that. And also supplementary to that, what discussions are happening with other universities out with of Scotland in the rest of the UK for people waiting for offers from them?
Minister Richard Lockhead.
Thank you. In all my discussions with our universities over the last few weeks, I've emphasised the importance of a very close dialogue between both further and higher education, and our colleges and universities both accept this is a time of all time to work much closer together to make sure we're supporting students during that transition from school to college or school to university in this case. So quite clearly, we have universities who are being very sympathetic towards the plight of our students, given what they're going through at the moment, and they're going to do all they can to support the students. UCAS have extended the window for students accepting their offers because of the current situation just now, and clearly we're paying very close attention to the levels of applications for further and higher education in Scotland. I can say the number of applications through the Student Awards Agency, where students, of course, are applying for their funding support, is actually far ahead of where it was this time last year. That may just be down to a timing issue because young people are at home and able to fill out their application forms, but it does show there's a significant interest in our young people in going to college and university at this time, and we're paying very close attention to that.
Thank you. Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Neil Bibby. Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when schools reopen and social distancing measures are in place, would he consider a phased approach to attendance which ensures those with additional physical and other disability needs go back in a more slower way than those within mainstream education?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
That may well be one of the options that we have to take forward. We'll have to give very considerable thought and take part in considerable discussion with our partners about how our schools may be able to return, because as I answered earlier to Jamie Green, there is going to be a persistent presence of the need for social distancing within our society whenever we move away from the current very restricted conditions that are applied right across society, which of course have led to the closure of schools. So as if we assume that social distancing is going to be an essential part of the way in which we relate to each other within our society in the future, there will obviously be implications of that for the way in which we organise and run our schools. Now, the assurance I would give to Mr Balfour is that we will be having extensive discussions with all of the stakeholders in education about how we do that. It is really important that we understand the requirements of individuals with special needs and that we support those individuals to enable the continuity of their education. So there will be a myriad of issues that we have to resolve as part of moving away from the lockdown situation that we are currently in, to make sure that we can get society back functioning in the way that we would expect it to be. But I think we're all going to have to acknowledge that's going to be a different way of operating to the one that preceded the outbreak of COVID-19.
Thank you. Neil Bibby, to be followed by Gordon MacDonald. Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Minister for Higher Education. I've heard this morning that not only are the University of West Scotland refusing to pay or to furlough staff on 0 hours contracts, but when students who are also on 0 hours contracts with the university apply to the Student Hardship Fund administered by UWS, they are being given £100 and told to find another job if they are an EU student, or in the case of a student who paid their own course fees rather than going through SAS, being told they will get nothing. The student in the latter case has been left with just £3.92 to live on for the rest of lockdown. There appears to be something wrong at UWS. Will the Minister agree to discussing these matters urgently with the principal of UWS and ensure that all UWS students facing hardship receive a payment and all 0 hours staff receive payment or are furloughed?
Minister Richard Lockhead.
Neil Bibby wishes to write to me, I'll certainly investigate these particular points. I would say, of course, whilst this is a very challenging situation for our universities, that we have re-emphasised the Scottish Government's determination that all of our further and higher education sectors should abide by our fair work principles and fair work agenda in Scotland, and they have given me assurances that that's certainly their intention. Of course, there's a myriad of circumstances out there, and I can't comment on each individual circumstance in terms of employment in each university, but we would expect the fair work principles that we support as a government to be adhered to by the sector. In terms of hardship funds for students, we are paying close attention to this issue. We recognise it's a very difficult situation for Scotland students, and indeed students who are studying in our country from elsewhere, who are doing our best to look after whilst they're here, and our universities are looking after as well, because quite often our students, of course, may have lost their part-time jobs and their income from other means, and therefore that hardship is reinforced. So on top of the £5.5 million we've already announced, we are of course looking for further opportunities to support our students at this time, and I will certainly look into the circumstances that Neil Bibby's outlined in his question just now.
Thank you very much. Can I call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Alexander Stewart? Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a question for Richard Lockhead, the Minister for Further and Higher Education. If the lockdown continues until the end of the year in some form or other, can the Minister explain how the Scottish Government will work with the higher education sector to help mitigate the financial impact of COVID-19 on our universities and colleges like Heriot-Watt, Edinburgh Napier and Edinburgh College in my constituency?
Minister Richard Lockhead.
Yep, I thank Gordon MacDonald for the question. As I've indicated previously, our universities are putting in a monumental amount of work just now trying to plan for all the different scenarios. We do expect a drop in international students. We don't know to what extent, but if it was up to a 50% drop, for instance, that could cost our higher education sector £400 million of lost income. And indeed, Heriot-Watt University that was mentioned there is one university that's been particularly successful in attracting international students. So at the moment, we're working very closely with the Scottish Funding Council and University Scotland and individual institutions to plan for all different scenarios. And as I said before, this is not just an issue that's going to face Scotland's universities. The rest of the UK is affected as well, and therefore we're making representations to the UK government that we do need a support package for Scotland's universities and indeed further in higher education. And we'll continue to keep members updated as to how that progresses and what steps we're taking as a Scottish Government to support the sector.
Thank you. And Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a question for the Cabinet Secretary. Due to the cancellation of exams, teachers have been tasked with issuing grades for pupils based on previous casework, marks and prelims. Some teachers have raised concerns that grades might be set aside to better reflect national averages. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that this will not be the case and that no pupils will be disadvantaged as a result of efforts to secure year-on-year comparisons?
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
The Scottish Qualifications Authority, in setting out the approach that they intend to pursue in these unprecedented circumstances, have said that at the heart of their approach will be fairness for learners, and that's a standard which the SQA will want to make sure is the case throughout the way in which the assessment process is handled. At the very core of the assessment process this year will be the question of teacher judgment, and the SQA have issued the guidance to teachers to assist them in the identification of grades, and that will inevitably involve a great deal of dialogue and discussion within individual schools to determine what should be submitted on behalf of individual pupils. Now, clearly, in any national examination system, we have to have confidence that the same standards are being applied in all parts of the country. An A, a B or a C in the north of Scotland must be the same as an A, B and C in the south of Scotland. So moderation across the education system has been a hallmark of the education system throughout the exams process that we have had, and it will have a role to play within the exam system that we take forward. The SQA has been quite clear about what will be involved in that moderation process, and they will set out further guidance on all of that approach in due course. But the fundamental question that the system depends upon is the delivery of teacher judgment, school by school, classroom by classroom, around the country. And the SQA have given teachers a longer period of time to formulate those judgments to enable the assessment process to be able to come to a conclusion and for certification to be issued on the 4th of August, which was always the date in which certification was designed to take place.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And can I say thank you very much to all our members and our ministers for participating today. We will be back tomorrow for another virtual question time at 3 p.m, this time on the twin subjects of rural affairs and the environment. Until then, can I thank you very much for joining us, and I close this meeting. Thank you.